You are listening to the Unusually Well-Informed podcast.
Welcome to the Unusually Well-Informed podcast. I'm your host, Tim Hampton. My unusually well-informed guest today is Katie Anderson. Katie is an internationally recognized leadership coach, consultant, and speaker with over 20 years of experience developing people-centered learning cultures across a range of industries. Today, Katie and I are discussing her best-selling book, Learning to Lead, Leading to Learn.
Yay!
Katie, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Tim. I've been looking forward to having this conversation for a few months now, so I'm excited the day is here.
Me too. I'm delighted to meet you, and it's a fascinating subject, so I can't wait to get started. So in your book, Learning to Lead, Leading to Learn, you point out that Toyota began not as a car company, but as a manufacturer of equipment for the textile industry. Mm-hmm. This serves as the inspiration for a metaphor involving warp and weft. Can you share what that is?
Yes. And, the warp and weft metaphor is one that I discovered through the process of writing the book. So a little context. Yes, Toyota was originally a weaving company. It was Toyota Automatic Loom Works, and founded by Mr. Toyota, who wanted to make things better for his wife, not his wife, for his mother. And so he did a lot of quality improvement and really a great innovator. And as I was writing this book, so the lessons of my good friend and mentor, Isao Yoshino, who worked at Toyota from the 1960s to the early 2000s, and really reflecting on his life, out of this, I kept saying, there seems to be a few threads that unite your life. And he said, well, it's interesting. We have this metaphor in Japan about kimono weavers, of the warp threads. And I'm holding up the book because actually the warp and the weft are part of the visual on the book, are the vertical threads that are laid down on a loom. And they're really constant and they're purposeful, and they generally don't break, and they just unite everything, but they're often not as visible or seen. And then the warp threads are the more visible threads that get woven in between and around. And those are the threads that are more likely to break when you're weaving. And it really reflected to me. So he shared with me this metaphor about how it was kind of the known and the discovered. And I was really taken by it. And I said, yes, this actually, not only are these threads that I've been seeing that are constants and discovered elements of your life, it just fits so nicely with it. And it's that intersection. And if you're watching this, you can see my hands together of the known and discovered elements. I mean, we all have some things in our lives that, have really been those elements that have kind of pulled us through or have been constants, that have driven our sense of purpose, or where we find meaning, that have just something that's always been there for us. And those are different for every individual. And then those are elements that we've learned and discovered as we've gone through the course of our lives. And maybe those mistakes and the failures and sometimes successes, but it's really that the richness of our life purpose and fabric is that intersection of the two, and how perhaps the course of our life maybe follows those warp threads that are set down. There's some things that compel us, but the richness and the texture comes from the things that we learn. And so I just thought it was a really beautiful metaphor, and also gave me a way to tell both his personal stories and then the more professional elements about learning and leading.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, that is one of the tricks to writing a book, is to weave a narrative. And there you found the perfect metaphor. I love it.
I was going to say that was one of the biggest challenges of thinking about how to write this book, because I knew there was just so many rich stories and so many rich lessons, but the structure, and might you say the loom on which you create and share it with readers, I think that's the real creative challenge for an author. And once I finally found it, it was just this aha moment, and it made everything so much easier.
Yeah, it's terrific. So as you say, the book is about, and it's Isao Yoshino. Am I pronouncing that?
Isao Yoshino, yes.
Isao Yoshino. What were the warp threads in his life?
So the warp threads, those constants for him, were really connected with having experiences that are more broad in the world. So when he was born and growing up in Japan around the time of the end of World War II, it wasn't very common for people to have had experiences outside of even their small villages. It was a very localized culture. And he had this experience with an American soldier, and he was really taken by the sort of the kind and bigger demeanor from this person. He's like, oh, I want to experience something more. And that has really been a driving force for him throughout his life. It inspired him to learn English as a young child, or as a child and teenager. He then majored in Spanish at university. One of the reasons he chose to work at Toyota after graduation from college in the late 1960s was because he thought it might give an opportunity to move overseas. And then he worked with perseverance and a lot of patience to finally get that overseas assignment. And he ended up living in the United States for 14 years. And even now in his late 70s, being connected with people globally is such an important part of who he is, and having a bigger perspective than just a very localized one. And so that's really been one of his warp threads. And then it's also deeply connected with learning as well.
Absolutely. So back in March 2021, I know it seems like a long time ago, but New York Times reported, and I'll quote here, workers at a plant in Baltimore manufacturing 2 coronavirus vaccines accidentally conflated the ingredients several weeks ago, contaminating up to 15 million doses of Johnson & Johnson's vaccine, end quote. So this is a perfect example of blaming the people and not the process.
Yeah.
How does this contrast with a formative moment in the life of Isao Yoshino?
Yeah, that's a great contrast of this experience that he had. And I imagine would be a very similar experience someone would have at Toyota today. And before I go into the story, I actually want to highlight a quote that I introduce in the very beginning of the book that Mr. Yoshino said to me when I was trying to discover from, like, what is the secret sauce to Toyota? Like, why are so many people trying to emulate it? What is the secret behind its continuous improvement, people-centered culture? And he kept saying there is no secret. And one day he said, maybe the only secret is its attitude towards learning. And this, I think, is fundamental to explain the culture in which he had this experience of making a pretty big mistake at work, and how this was an opposite example. And I actually can't even think of any organization that I've worked with that this would have happened, because it's not our cultural norm, but one that I challenge us all to do. So he had just graduated from college and was starting his orientation program at Toyota. So this is in 1966, I believe. And another interesting element is that Toyota didn't just have like a 1 day, 1 week orientation. It was a multi-month orientation, a few weeks in the classroom to understand, the sort of the key foundations about Toyota. And then they assigned all these young college graduates roles in the Gemba, or in the place the work is done. So they were assigned manufacturing plant roles, even though they were all going to have back office jobs. None of them were engineers going to work on the front line. And Mr. Yoshino was not an engineer. He has a Spanish degree. He was going to go work in the export department and do paperwork, So he was assigned to one of his roles. He was assigned to the paint shop, and his role, or his responsibility, was to pour a can of solvent in a pan of paint into a big vat, and then it would, spray on the cars as it came down the line. And, a few weeks into this, one day, one of the shop floor managers ran into the paint shop and said, "The paint's not sticking to the cars." And it looked like 100 cars were going to have to be repainted. Like, it's like literally not sticking to the cars, it's dripping off. And of course, all eyes went on to young Mr. 22-year-old Isao Yoshino. And he's thinking, like, that clearly was my mistake.
That's the end.
Yeah, totally the end. And what was interesting is he reflected when telling me this story for the first time, and he actually hadn't remembered this in years. And he said, maybe their first instinct was to like blame him, but that didn't come out. Like, for a moment, they probably had the, oh my gosh moment, but they walked up to him kindly and with patience and said, "Show us the process that you did to pour the paint and the solvent into the vat." And so it was very clear when he did that the cans were labeled very similarly, and it would have been very easy to make that mistake. But not only did they not blame him, the manager thanked him for making the mistake. thanked him because it highlighted that they had not set up the working conditions in the department for someone to be successful at their job. And this now gave them the opportunity to make an improvement so that it wouldn't happen again.
That's amazing.
And it's mind blowing. He was actually really like he hadn't thought about this. He was laughing in like kind of like, wow, like that was an amazing experience. And also reflecting what a powerful experience it had on him as a fundamental experience of working at Toyota and about the kind of leader he wanted to be and continue to embody and pass on in his chain of learning with others as well.
Absolutely. I mean, the faith you would feel in the company and in people's opportunity to make genuine mistakes and just have the organization learn, it's beautiful. I recently ordered an office chair online for my son. And as we were putting it together, I realized that one of the arms was packaged in clear plastic and the other one was packaged in blue plastic. And I was in the process of reading your book and I realized that probably the point there was to make sure you got a matching set.
Yeah.
And so somebody had probably filled 100 boxes with all left arms at one point, and they had to rethink the process. So it really is, it's affirmative in so many ways.
Yeah. And it's a real reminder too about how our human instinct is to blame a person, but if we can focus on the process, we learn so much more, and also people are much more engaged. I mean, I recently had an experience where there was a pretty big mistake, which I'm going to be talking about on Mark Graven's My Favorite Mistake podcast coming up soon. But one that, I had this time, like I had some frustration and disappointment and a big mistake that was made in my business, but I was really trying to embody the principles of this book and think about, well, okay, I can be disappointed and upset with the outcome, but let's look at the process. And also what were some of the actions that I took or didn't take that also contributed to this? What was my role as the leader of this project or initiative? And some of the things that I did so that I can also create a situation that's better in the future. And if I lead with kindness too, and acknowledging there was a mistake and there's disappointment in that, however, let's focus on the process. It had such a better outcome for everyone all around. And so it was the pain story is one that challenges us all to do better as well. And as parents as well, it's an important lesson as well.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, definitely. I promise to take a page out of the book on that. Yeah. So we've talked a little bit about some of the cultural differences that set Toyota apart from a lot of businesses, but there's a whole Toyota way, and there's principles that you laid out in your book.
Yeah,
I'd love to get into. I'll just list them out so that there's some coherence for the listener, and then I'll ask you to go into each one if you could. One is challenge, then Kaizen, then go to the source, then respect for people, and then teamwork. And other than Kaizen, which some people may not be familiar with, I think a lot of people would sort of see that as a matched set, but the Toyota is very targeted with those. So can we look at challenge and how is challenge set at Toyota?
Yeah. So, and we can talk too about how some of the way those words were translated from the Japanese, and Toyota did the translation, actually influence a slightly different meaning in English than I think were originally intended for there. So I'd love to dive into that second. But first, so the Toyota Way was actually a document that was created and published internally in 2001 for those people who haven't had a chance to either read the book or have the context of the history. And it was Mr. Cho, who was the president of Toyota and chairman of Toyota at the time, his way of kind of retightening the belt, as Mr. Yoshino likes to say, on the culture at Toyota. And so it was about codifying those principles so that as they were expanding globally, people really understood. So setting a challenge is really about, and that is one of the 3 leadership principles that I talk about throughout the book, about what I call now the leading to learn framework. A leader is to set direction or a challenge, provide support, and to develop themselves. So this ties to setting the challenge. It's about setting a long-term goal that's based on what's needed, not just by what we think is achievable. And this gets back to that concept and attitude towards learning. How do we set a goal based on really where we need to go, what we need to do for our customers, for our people, for the organization? And then that challenges us to unite our actions and also to go beyond where we think we can right now. And they do that through a process they call Hoshin Kanri, which is strategy, often the translated to be strategy deployment, but it's about how do we connect each individual and department to achieving that goal. So everyone knows how the work that they do each and every day ties into achieving those big challenges for the organization.
So I love both parts of that. If there's more than two, forgive me, but I love the idea of having a stretch goal, because if it's too easily achieved, then people can sort of loaf their way to it.
Yeah.
And I really like the idea of everybody having a real clear sense of what their contribution is.
Yes.
That's so empowering, because there are, I mean, not everybody at Toyota is building a car.
No, right. And I think it's true. Like every organization, there are people doing the direct, frontline value creation work. And then there's all the people supporting that. And so how do we understand our connection to the value that's being created?
So what is your definition of Kaizen?
So, well, my definition of Kaizen, I think it's twofold. So it's typically translated to be continuous improvement. And that is actually how in the document, Toyota translated that pillar as continuous improvement. But there's two words in the Japanese document, and I think it's more powerful. So it's wisdom and Kaizen. And so it's about learning. And so we miss out on, so first Kaizen also the symbols that represent Kaizen, the word Kaizen, come from self and whip, and then sacrifice for the good. And so it's about how do we improve ourselves for the betterment of the good. So it's not just about improving processes. So it's about discipline, it's about self-discipline, it's about looking at ourselves and making improvements for the good. And then if we couple that with the concept of chie, which is wisdom, and whipping ourselves for the betterment of the good, that's about creating learning that is connected down. And this is me doing hands, which I like to call the chain of learning, so that we can accelerate and amplify that learning and build upon it. So to me, the definition of Kaizen is about starting with ourselves to make improvements for the good, and how that is connected with learning and creating wisdom.
Okay, beautiful. And then you talk about going to the source, and I'd like it if you could sort of challenge or break apart the difference between going to the Gemba, which you mentioned earlier, and management by walking around, which you hear in North America quite a bit.
Yeah. So Gemba is just a Japanese word that means the place something happens. So like a weather reporter would say, I'm standing in the Gemba. I mean, of course, in Japanese. But in English, typically Gemba in a business environment or context means the place the work is done. And so one of the key tenets of the Toyota Way and Toyota Way leadership is about going to the place the work is actually done, or even talking to our customers and going to see their experience. So not just staying in our conference room or office and managing by reports or managing by discussion, but actually going out and seeing the real people doing the real work and their real experiences. And the difference between sort of going to see or going to Gemba and this management by walking around is it's about having a real intention and purpose, and about connecting with the people doing the work and checking on both the process of they're working towards achieving an outcome, and also their process of learning as well. So the status of their learning towards that.
Right.
And it's going
and management by walking around almost has an air of trying to catch people not doing their job.
Yeah. It's either like a flyby, like a, hey, how you doing? You're seeing I'm being just a nice guy. I'm showing my face, is a real, almost like check the box. Like I showed my face, or management's going to come here today, so we need to like buff everything up and make it look good and hide the problems.
Yeah.
So I think what that your comment really made me think of is an important key element of Toyota's culture as well, which is their philosophy that no problem is a problem and bad news first. And so they really embrace making problems visible. And so then it's not a problem to be sharing the mistakes or the things that aren't working. So we don't need to buff up and hide that. In fact, leaders will ask for the challenges and ask for the problems. So if you don't have any problems and everything looks perfect, to them, that's going to be a problem. And so that's a real difference in attitude towards, I'm coming to check that everything's okay, versus I'm coming to check yes, we want everything to be okay, but I'm really wanting to see where I can help, and also how are people thinking and solving problems.
Right. What support can I offer? So
Yes,
it's
right.
helping by walking around a little bit
Yes,
more. Yeah.
yes.
Respect for people is the next principle
Mm,
of the Toyota way. Toyota is a car manufacturer, but you say Toyota makes people. What does that look
mm.
like?
Yeah, well, that's something Mr. Yoshino, in fact, anyone who's worked at Toyota will say is like, we make people first so that we can make cars, or while we make cars. And so they put people first. Again, that attitude towards learning and people development is first. And if we do that, then we're going to be more successful at doing whatever our product or service is. And so it's about, again, this attitude towards learning and seeing that a leader's role is not just to like get results, but it's about developing people's capability and confidence so that they can get the results.
And then finally, teamwork. And then I'd like to sort of expand on what that means at Toyota. There's teamwork, which we're all familiar with, which is like a 2-pizza team, right? Maybe 6-10 people working together, and you get that sort of unit cohesion. But then how do you make a team work within an organization too?
Yeah, those are many questions in there that we could spend a whole podcast talking about.
Yeah, I'm sure.
So,
I'm greedy.
So they define teamwork as, stimulating and supporting professional development for everyone as individuals and as teams as well. And it's not just about maximizing individual performance, but maximizing team performance too. And I think, again, that gets back to how do we define what success is about? And I find too, so often in organizations in the US and other Western countries is we have a real focus on performance evaluations about what did you person achieve rather than what was the outcome of your team or the organization, which then incentivizes focusing on me, myself, and I, not focusing on the output of the team. And in fact, Toyota had a real, they saw this starting to happen a bit in the late 1970s with some of their leaders, and this is in the book. And they put together a 2-year leadership development program. And Mr. Yoshino was in his 30s, was one of the lucky people who got to be like, one of the handful of like 5 people supporting this program for all these senior leaders. And one of the key foci was about leaders really learning again or relearning again that achieving their goals wasn't about them achieving their goals. It was them having clarity on what the goal is. So setting that direction, and then what they were going to do to provide the support to help their team achieve the goals. And so again, really putting that back on to, the executives were saying this down to their senior leaders. And so that was emphasizing that is the value that we have in this organization. And that's how we foster teamwork. But if we're rewarding individual success, then we're going to see a different outcome.
Yeah, for sure. So not part of not core to that 5 list of Toyota ways, but one of the phrases that you used in the book that I thought was that really spoke to how Toyota operates was, and I'm quoting you in the book here, attaining a well-balanced process is more important than attaining the goal itself. And you sort of brushed on that when you said that it was more important to have people who were able to make a good car than necessarily having a good car.
Yes. Well, right. And so I think this actually gets back to what makes up a learning organization too. It's like, if you're only focused on the result, then you're like just throwing darts. Like, are we going to achieve it? We're not looking about how we're getting there. Can we replicate it? We're just trying a bunch of stuff, but we're not doing it with a learning mindset or even setting a hypothesis of, if we do that, this is what we expect to happen. What do we need to adjust along the way? And how can we then really put that emphasis again on the process and we want the outcome, of course. We want to be going towards the outcome, but we want an outcome we can replicate. We want an outcome that we can continuously, or a process we can continuously improve and make better. And so if we forget about looking at that process, we're unlikely to be able to really continuously improve and learn.
Absolutely. Mr. Yoshino observes that senior management doesn't need to poke its nose in or micromanage, as we might say. So help me sort of calibrate on this, because there is a push and a pull. How can leaders focus on the Gemba and the big picture at the same time, or are they expected to? Is there a difference between what they should do versus people on the line?
Well, right. So again, so I love, he uses this phrase, poking your nose in, and he used that throughout when we were talking about different leaders. And yes, it's the difference between getting in someone's business, or I like to say, like, telling people exactly what to do. I often talk about these leadership continuums of how do we balance telling versus asking. And this is how do we let people have responsibility for problem solving, but they have clarity of expectations and direction of where they need to go. And so the difference of micromanaging versus more macro managing is leaders looking at the big picture, setting the direction and the clarity of where we need to go, or what good looks like, or the target that someone needs to be achieving, and then not getting in there and taking over the responsibility of doing it, but providing the support to that person. So what learning and development do they need? What barriers do they need removed? So that's the support element, but not taking over the responsibility. And so the poking the nose is when I'm coming in and I'm getting all like in your space, and I'm actually I'm taking over that responsibility from you. And so you need to have that balance between setting the challenge and the direction and providing the support, but giving the space for learning. And where the poking the nose comes in is it's taking over both.
So I love that, because one of the questions I had later on, but you've sort of set the table for it. And that is this idea that leaders should only ask, which is a bad interpretation of it's not what you said, but you said that we need to check our impulse to tell all the time. But you just sort of opened my eyes to the idea that leaders should be telling what it is we're aiming for, not how to aim.
Yes.
And the questions are, how can we improve the process? Well, they're doing the process. They ought to know it.
Yes, exactly. So it's not in either or. It's not leaders or should only be telling or only asking, but it's what is the right action for the purpose. And I would say too, there is an element of being more directive or teaching that some people need when there's beginners in something. So just asking questions isn't going to be helpful. But yeah, set that direction and then to provide the support that's going to help the other person move forward to be creative and to be engaged and to contribute to solving that problem or achieving that goal.
I love it. See, I'm learning directly from the author. This is terrific.
Oh, no, it's great. And I was telling you before we got started that this morning I led a workshop for a live audience of like 800 people for the state of Washington. And my topic was breaking your telling habit. And we talked about this very thing. And to me, it's the crux of like the leadership challenge of what we need to do is learn how to navigate that continuum between telling and asking, and knowing when is the right time to do both. And we default to one or the other. Usually we default to telling, and then we over pivot and we think, oh, leadership's only about asking. And no, sometimes you need to be directive as well. So how do you balance both?
Yeah, I love it. Sometimes I have this idea that if somebody walked up to a bowler and noticed they were always bowling to the left, the advice to bowl to the right would be useful. But that doesn't mean only bowl. I mean, if you're guttering on the other side, that doesn't help either. There's wisdom, right? There's you need to aim for the actual pins.
Well, right. And also where's the pin that you need to hit down? You got to adjust it a little bit. So it's what the learner needs or what pin you need to knock down. I actually have a free guide about breaking your telling habit on my website. So we can link to that in the show notes, but it's kbjanderson.com/telling-habit. So
perfect. I'll add that as well. Thank you.
Great.
So you're so good. You've answered, I think, the next question, but Mr. Yoshino, you pointed out that I'll sort of paraphrase what you said, that the warp thread was really drawing him to an international career, particularly in the States. And I think the idea of joining Toyota, I mean, America's always been the center of car culture. So what a perfect fit there. But then he wound up in the US, and it wasn't quite the dream job it wasn't what he'd anticipated.
Yeah.
But he took an attitude that we might call embracing the suck, right? He found a way to make it work. What role did his warp threads play at this time?
Yeah, no, great. And again, right before we got started recording, I was telling you I was recording a learning module for my Leading to Learn Accelerator, and it was focused exactly on this topic of the power of having a positive mindset and viewing things from a different angle. So for a little context, for those of you who don't know, Mr. Yoshino, as I mentioned, had this like lifelong dream to move to the US. And 20 years after he joined Toyota, he finally was granted a role in the San Francisco Bay Area, actually near to where I live currently. And he showed up, and the role was pretty sucky, to use your brace the suck. It was a big disappointment to him. Like he considered himself a glorified gopher. He was in his role title was to be the manager of the San Francisco liaison office, which was supporting the Numi plant, the joint venture between Toyota and General Motors over in Fremont here in the San Francisco Bay Area. But what he found himself doing was like, I don't know, like concierge services for the expats supporting the facility. And he was like super bummed. And he was like, this is not what I thought it was going to be. His family was having a hard time transitioning. He had a wife and 3 elementary and middle school age children who didn't really know how to speak English. So like it was a really hard time, and he was ready to quit. In fact, like he was ready to give up. And he said he had this conversation with his dad. It was actually a really pivotal moment for him. And his dad's like, what are you going to do? And he realized, my goodness, what am I going to do? I can either be miserable. So this is a 3-year assignment. I can be miserable for another 2.5 years. I can quit Toyota, which is like not something anyone really did in life. It's usually lifetime employment. So that wasn't going to go over very well. Or I can change my mindset and figure out a way to embrace this experience. And so he figured out a way to see his job from a different angle and embrace the positive side of it. And the way he did that is he decided he was going to be the number one in his job, and his team was going to be the best liaison office across Toyota and across all of, any Japanese company with overseas plants. And so that challenge towards excellence actually inspired them to do better work. And he saw every assignment and every seemingly mundane task as an opportunity to provide excellent customer service. And through that, he got joy and actually developed really good relationships with people in the San Francisco Bay Area, with Toyota senior executives who would come through, with San Francisco being their first stop, that really were quite important for him later in his career. And so that shift in mindset not only changed his own experience, but changed the experience of people around him.
And I think the metaphor would be those were the weft threads, right? Those are the threads that sort of filled that span of time.
Yes.
But the warp threads were still there, and it bridged the gap, if you will. It did bridge the gap. Point where he could do something.
Yeah. So through that time, he's still over there. He's like wanting to stay in the US. But like he would say those times were like black threads, they were broken, but then he shifted the color. He was like, I'm going to choose some different threads. I can keep weaving these terrible black thin threads that are like frayed and having a bad time, or I can choose something different and weave a different pattern through this. And in fact, it was only supposed to be a 3-year assignment, and he decided to stay on for a 4th year when he was asked. And so that just goes to show that you can weave and create your own life fabric in the pattern that you want. It's not always just what's done to you.
Absolutely. So Numi was an important part of Mr. Yoshino's career. Why was Numi important to Toyota? Can you tell the story of Numi a little bit?
Yes. And it's a well-documented case study for many things. So I encourage you, if you haven't read about Numi, obviously check out my book, because you get the behind the scenes stories, but also there's so many rich learnings here. So this is in the early 1980s when Toyota and other Japanese manufacturers were looking to expand their foreign production for the first time. And so some other companies decided to just start production at other parts in the US, and Toyota delayed that decision for a bit, and then decided they were going to start with a joint venture with General Motors. And this was a controversial decision within Toyota because there was a lot of complexity with General Motors. They were going to use the plant that was the former GM plant here in Fremont was the worst performing plant. And the agreement was they were going to use as many of the same employees at the same facility, and they were unionized. And the union had a historically really confrontational, like union and management had a really bad relationship. And so it was into this environment that Toyota was stepping. And their hypothesis was, well, if we're going to learn how to work in a foreign environment, let's choose a more challenging foreign environment, because if we can be successful here, we can be successful elsewhere. And so that was why it was important for Toyota. They really needed to see, could they translate their culture? And I also need to highlight that Toyota culture and Japanese culture are not synonymous. They are not one and the same. In fact, some of the elements of Japanese culture are things that Toyota has figured out how to do differently, like looking at the hierarchy within the Japanese culture. They flipped that so it's more of a servant leadership pyramid, and some other things as well. But then they had this challenge of like, how are we going to do this? And so again, this is where Mr. Yoshino had positioned himself through his warp threads of like learning English and positioning himself for a role. This is before he was assigned to the US. But because of his English skills, he was assigned to the newly created training department and tasked with the job of train the American frontline managers in the Toyota way. And when they were going to come to Japan on 3-week rotations. And so he was responsible for this training and development program for a few years. And it was a really foundational learning experience. And the amazing outcome from the Numi experience or joint venture was within 1 year, that facility went from being the worst performing plant at GM to being the top performing plant. And so it really showed that you can change culture, but that requires individuals changing and working together in a collaborative way.
It is an amazing turnaround. And it's also, it puts Mr. Yoshino in the heart of the idea of Toyota being a learning culture, because you're trying to embrace people in that culture by having them learn. It's not like you were saying in the beginning, even with his training, it wasn't, here's a pamphlet, we'll watch you for a week and make sure you fit in. This was actually the expense of flying people who are going to work at the plant to Japan. It's enormous investment.
It is enormous investment, and it didn't end there. So there were these cohorts of like 25 to 30 frontline and group leaders coming to Japan. They were partnered with a Japanese counterpart. And the Japanese didn't speak English. The Americans didn't speak Japanese, but they were partnered together and had this literally spent every moment together. And on the front line, they were working side by side together. So it was a week of classroom training. And just like Mr. Yoshino's orientation, a little bit more condensed, 2 weeks of working on the line. And through the learning by doing and seeing how the Toyota managers responded when, say, there was a quality issue on the line. Some of you may have heard the term pull the andon. This comes from actually making a signal or light shine when there is a mistake or challenge happening on the line that the worker is not going to be able to finish by the time that the moving line goes through his or her work area. And at the historic response at GM was look at quality issues at the end. And in fact, frontline workers were also like intentionally putting in quality issues.
Sure.
Yeah, but the difference was them seeing that the team and group leaders responded when people pulled the andon and said, I have a problem. They jumped in to help and to learn and to figure out and to provide that support. And that was an amazing contrasted experience. And they would say, wow, I want to take that back to work. What a different environment that is.
Well, and also, I think a lot of managers who might be like, yeah, respect, they think they're being hard-nosed, but they're not. They're not getting the results. Like, I'm sure the managers were insisting that people do a good job before Toyota showed up. Right. But it was changing the culture to mutual respect that really made the difference.
Yes, mutual respect. And, if we go back to those 3 elements, like, yeah, they're maybe setting out the challenge or the target, but they're not providing any support. So you need challenge and support to create that learning environment. Challenge with no support has a negative consequence. And then, as we talked about, support but no direction or the challenge to move towards, well, then we all feel good, but we're like, what are we doing with that?
Yeah. It's funny you mentioned the distinction between Toyota culture and Japanese culture, but I thought that this statement was a very different, reflected a culture that maybe we're not so familiar with here in North America. Mr. Yoshino takes the position that to be extraordinary, one must first be at least ordinary, which is a sentiment all parents, I'm sure, are like, yes, please just be ordinary first and then be extraordinary.
Yeah.
What lesson do you take from this advice?
I think it's about developing capability and just ability first, and then we can refine and really like improve and accelerate upon that. So to me, it's just it's the model of learning. So step by step and through being ordinary and to doing the things and getting capability and confidence, then we can really focus and choose one or two specific things that we're just going to really accelerate on and be stand out. But we need to develop that baseline of capability first.
Yeah, there's a real humility that is required on all sides of the organization, right? That just because I'm the boss doesn't mean I know as much as what's going on as you do. Yeah. And if I'm starting out in the organization, I probably have a lot to learn. And so it feeds into that learning culture. When you were saying that, people can be pulled in too many different directions by too many challenges, it reminded me of something you said in the book about you can't chase two hares at once because you just wind up with neither, right? Yeah. So there's a real sense of focus to what's going on at Toyota.
Yes. And that ties to your question too, how they set challenges, how they set direction. It's a Japanese proverb, chase two hares, you will catch neither. So you got to put your energy in one area. And perhaps that's what this was saying with us about being extraordinary. If you try and be the best at everything and excellent, but if we can really put your energy towards one thing, move towards it, you can get better.
So when we look at this and we can see the difference that culture makes, like Numi is a great sort of petri dish for seeing that. We've introduced a new ingredient, which is the Toyota culture, and it changes the result. Can culture only be shaped from the top? Or like, how could one make that change if you're not in charge of the whole organization?
Yeah, that is a question I get asked all the time, both when before I even met Mr. Yoshino, because, I was working with leaders and with middle managers, leading continuous improvement initiatives, first in healthcare and then with other organizations. And sometimes the senior leaders were not really involved or engaged. And, I like to talk about how we all have influence in the areas around us, and we can sort of start to create and expand a culture. A culture is really just the norms of actions and behaviors of of a group of people. And so we can influence that. Now, that being said, and you can then maybe sort of demonstrate up to the leaders sort of why this kind of attitude or culture might be more beneficial or good. However, if you don't have the senior leadership ultimately bought in, they can squash that culture right from the beginning. So I think you can influence it for sure, but senior leaders really have to walk the talk as well. What do you think about that? I think it's a really important question.
Well, so one of the reasons I'm hopeful is because generally speaking, if you're creating that culture and you're not in charge of the whole organization, it's because you're relatively new there. Well, eventually you're going to move up the ranks. And so if there's truth to this idea that bringing respect is one important ingredient to Numi change things as much as it did, it could change that as much in your department too.
Yes.
And so why wouldn't you and the people working with you rise through the ranks with that attitude?
Yeah.
And so it's an infection of sorts, right? It takes a long time to spread.
Yes. And I think that ties to what I was saying to you. Like you have the influence and you can expand from there. So it requires patience but it also requires the organizational commitment and a new senior leader not being brought in from the outside and then being like, squashing it down as well.
That's right. So you see a lot of headlines that this is drifting a little bit into sort of some of the ideas that I've heard about Toyota. The Toyota production system is also often, am I correct in thinking it's often called lean? Like I know that there are people who sort of disagree, though, that's not quite the same thing, but
Well,
there's a relationship there, isn't there?
well, there is. And so, I'm not an expert in the whole uh, sort of naming and all this, but when in the 1980s, a lot of researchers were really trying to understand what the secret to success was of Japanese car manufacturers, and in particular Toyota. And so we're going out to visit Japan and study these companies. And one of one of the key researchers, Jim Womack, and his team came up with the word lean as describing what they observed from the production side, which is about, doing more with less. So creating more value by using less, doing less. And I'm totally not bringing in the whole definition here. But a lot of people forget it was like the doing more or creating more value with less. They just see less, the lean. So that was that was the word that they used to describe the production capabilities. And then at that time, then it morphed from there, the word lean becoming synonymous with Toyota's production system and culture. What they talk about now, and I've heard Jim Womack personally speak about this, is that what they wish they had emphasized more were the things like Mr. Yoshino says around the attitude towards learning. They described a lot more of the production processes and the visible artifacts and things that are really important around how do you look at process and how do you create, look at value in one piece flow. And all of those elements are really critical, but really it goes back to an attitude towards learning and about people. And they wish they had emphasized that more. So yes, the word lean is because that was what some American researchers used to describe what they were observing about Toyota. However, the Toyota production system continues to evolve and morph as well as any system does. And then how lean has been used and described has gone off into many, many, many different pieces into the world. So there's no sort of one uniting, there's some common elements, but when you say lean, it may mean different things to different people.
Well, and so maybe I'm drifting too far off topic, but I just thought because lean is associated with Toyota, I wonder what your reaction is to all this talk of the supply chains falling apart because they're too lean. I was just wondering if that was getting under your nails a little bit because people are misinterpreting what lean really means?
Yeah, well, again, yes, I think that's people coming at it from that very tools and very narrow look at sort of how lean has been seen globally without going to the real heart of it. So if we're really looking at the Toyota production system or what it should be around just in time and what that really means, rather than, it's taking from a very narrow element. In fact, John Shook and some others have written some really good articles recently about the impact of why don't blame like the Toyota production system or lean on or just in time on all of the global supply chain. In fact, we need to look at it from a different angle.
Yeah, especially since it's called just in time. It's not called late, right?
Yeah.
The idea is that, the circumstances changed really quickly. A lot of things were upset by that.
Well, right. And also, you're supposed to you have to know what it takes to be just in time. And sometimes you do need some inventory buffer, so that it can be just in time. It's not about always eliminating inventory. In fact, it's the principle is about challenging us thinking about how might we do that and how might we improve it. But it's not just a rigid application. It's about a thinking process. Yeah.
So I'm not a manufacturing expert at all, but I am very interested in it. And one of the things that strikes me when I read about the Toyota production system, a lot of it is talking about improving what happens on the production line. So it strikes me that it's about improving the quality of the product or the consistency of the product. Where does Toyota, or how does Toyota make time for improving the product itself? How does that connect into the process?
Yeah, so I've never worked at Toyota, and so I can only answer your question by what I've heard from Mr. Yoshino. So, like you asked, like, don't come from manufacturing originally. I came from health policy and healthcare, and now work across industries as well. But again, I think it's because we see like training and time for continuous improvement as all just sort of offline things that happen outside of doing the work. And I think the real important point is it's about making improvements while we're doing the work. And then of course, being given some time to do some problem solving or work on projects as well. But not seeing learning and improvement as something that's separate from part of our daily job.
Beautiful. Okay. So while we have a little bit of time left, I have to ask about your writing process. Now, you talked a little bit at the beginning about how you sort of came across this guiding metaphor for the book, but what was it like? Was it 1,000 words a day? Was it spits and starts? How did you focus and get the work done?
Oh my gosh, a great question. Good Hansei, good reflection for me. So first, the idea for this book started because I was writing blog posts when I first moved to Japan in 2015 about my conversations with Mr. Yoshino, and he was generous to let me write about our conversations. And of course, like a once in a lifetime, one day event that I thought would turn into like this relationship where I would go down and visit him many times. Anyway, when I returned to the United States in about 18 months after we moved to Japan, continued to write about our conversations. And he's like, maybe we should write a booklet. And I knew enough to know that
a booklet, yes,
like a booklet. I think he was thinking more like a little like pamphlet or like, maybe like a 20-page guide. Like he had done this. And if you read the book, he talked about how he created like these learning booklets for some of his staff. But I was like, there's so much more in here. I was like, yes, let's write a book. I love like the collaboration that we have between you being this retired Toyota leader in your 70s and me being this continuous improvement leadership coach in my 40s, coming from the US and Japan and having lived in each other's countries. There's something there. There's synergy. So I originally thought that the book, this is a long answer, but I think it gets to
it's good. This is what I want.
So I had this idea. It's like, we're going to write a book, both talking about our own stories. We knew that I was going to be the main writer, but that I would do interviews with him and then I would synthesize and
so it was going to feel like a duet.
It was going to feel like a duet. And it was going to be more like talking about like a leadership principle, like leadership principle X, and then maybe some stories and talking about why that was important. And so I started with but I was like, regardless, I need to do these interviews and start to really draw out your stories. And I had all these different pieces of scraps of paper and things I'd written for years. And then as I started to do deeper reflection with him, and just starting from when he was a child all the way, then the second interview, I remember very clearly when he talked about that paint story, I was like, gosh, there's so many stories here. And I was trying to fit them neatly into like a leadership principle. And then when I was writing, I just felt kind of clunky. I was like, yeah, I can write about this, but like people know about this leadership principle. And as we kept learning and more, I was like, you know what? I really think that his story needs to be told, and his learning, like the learning he had, and where I can really contribute from my stories, like putting it all together, synthesizing these stories that didn't come out in just like one neat like interview. Some of the experiences and multi-year stories or lessons or experiences came together from like 2 years of us talking and me going back and learning. And so really pulling out and almost being a combination of biographer, but synthesizer, and then asking those reflection questions to help people learn. So to frame the stories and to frame the learning and put it in a way that allow people to take what they need and want from that story and lesson as well. So to do the writing, oh my gosh, I just started to write all the stories. And I first started to write the book in those, like trying to do like 10 or 12 leadership principles. And I was just getting really stuck. I then had that aha moment when I discovered the warp and weft, and also allowed myself to make a change in how I was structuring the book and decided to really write it from the arc of his learning and his history. And that really freed me. And when I could really just embrace the storytelling, that's when the writing really flowed. And so I was able to repurpose things that I had written before, and some of the framing and the commentary I have about things came from that time. but that was the process. And people have told me you usually write books twice. Like you write the first draft and then you throw it away and write the second. And I was like, oh no. Oh yes. That was really how it was. I can't even quantify the number of hours, probably that like thousands of hours spent working on this book. And but it's a great joy to have been able to help Mr. Yoshino reflect on his life and see things from a different angle. And the impact the book has had globally and people saying how inspired they are makes it all worthwhile to me. So
yeah, well, the care that went into it is evident. I mean, it's a terrific book. One of the and it makes me ask, I think it is your first book.
It is my first published book, although I did pull out my master's thesis and my undergraduate thesis as well. So actually I came from an academic writing perspective, but it's my first book. Actually, I have a second book that's a companion workbook to the learning to lead, leading to learn. And that up until recently has only been available digitally, but soon, and probably by the time of this podcast release, it'll be available on Amazon as well. But yes.
Perfect.
Yes.
Well, the reason I ask is when I've asked other authors about their experience writing a book, there's often this trough of despair, right? And I'm wondering if you were spared that because you felt an obligation to this living person you're documenting the life of, that you can't self-flagellate too much, like, oh, this is all terrible, because you had to, the warp thread for this was honoring somebody else.
And that was really wonderful. Like, it wasn't just about me. It was about honoring my friend. And of course, it's a labor of creativity and hard work on my behalf as well. But it was a real partnership of us. And I really feel like it's my homage to Mr. Yoshino, my gift to him and to the world as well. I mean, he's just such a man of such rich knowledge and wisdom and caring. But it was a lot of hard work as well. So, and he was a real partner in the book. And he feels so honored, and I'm thrilled. The book's been translated actually into Spanish. It's already out in Spanish. It's being translated to Polish, and the Japanese version is coming out early in 2022. And I'm just so thrilled that he'll be able to share the book with some of his former colleagues and one of his most special bosses, Mr. Segura. Yeah.
I'm sure a lot of people will be really fascinated by that because in many ways it's an external perspective. So yeah, well done.
Yeah. So thank you.
What project? Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I'll answer my question.
Well, no, go ahead, because I'm right at the last question. So.
Okay. Well, I was gonna say I probably have another book in me, but I've had little post-traumatic, book writing experience. So I get asked that question often, like, when are you writing your next book? I mean, the workbook even to itself was a big task, but it was much easier because it's a companion to the book. But I do feel like I'm a learner. I'm an academic at heart. and I love synthesizing information. And so I'm sure there will be another book in me. I'm just not sure what it is yet.
Well, it is a hell of an experience because you might think you understand something until you try to write about it for somebody else. And then you really have to learn it more.
Well, and write it. And I think this is what gets to the challenge I had when I was trying to put it neatly into different principles is like, there's so many leadership books like that. And that really stories are what engage people. I love to read this, like the stories where there's lessons and knowledge gained from the stories, but not just being like, the telling, like, this is how it is, this is what it is, but like inspiring and like, so whatever I do next, and I'm putting this out to my challenge to myself as I am talking to you, so is to, yes, do teaching, but inspire through story.
Right.
Yeah. All right. On to your last question.
Well, thank you, Katie. This has been terrific. I just have one final question, and you've talked about a couple of things, and I think I've maybe even heard it here first. You have a second book coming. I'm kidding.
No.
What projects?
Sometime in the greater
in the future? Yes. Along the warp thread. What projects are you working on now, and how can people engage with your work?
Yeah, great. Thank you. So a real focus of mine this last year was also how do I continue to take the learnings of the book as well as all of the lessons that I've learned and the practical, tangible leadership and coaching and problem solving skills. And so one of the exciting things that I created this past year, this is 2021, was the Leading to Learn Accelerator, which is a combination of learning through the book and also learning with me and the practices and principles. So I'm running the second cohort right now of that. I'll be offering it again next year, both as just a fully self-paced course, as well as with the live coaching with me. Continuing to offer workshops like Breaking the Telling Habit and other workshops that now that we're in the pandemic, I used to be just, hired by organizations to come in and work with their leadership teams, which I still do in this remote environment, but also being able to engage with individuals that way. So you can find out more about my different courses and offerings on my website, which is kbjanderson.com. On my courses page has the different online options that you can engage with, my Accelerator, and of course the book and the workbook, which is now available, not the workbook, the book's available in audiobook too, which was another fun project that I recently finished. So
Did you do the reading?
I did do the reading.
Excellent. Good choice.
Yeah, thank you. I felt like it was such a personal story and experience that it really needed to be read.
It sounded funny coming from somebody else's mouth.
Yeah, it was. Yeah. So you can listen to me for 8.5 hours with a little Anshuk and Mr. Yoshino tucked in there as well.
Terrific. Katie, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you so much. And remember to, if you want the free guide about breaking the telling habit, that's in the show notes on my website, kbjanderson/telling habit. Thank you so much, Tim. I loved your questions and I loved the conversation. And I'd love to hear from listeners about what was a takeaway that they've had from this discussion.
Terrific. My guest today was Katie Anderson. Katie's LinkedIn profile and more information on where to get her book, Learning to Lead, Leading to Learn, will be in the show notes, along with a link to her website and the workbook. My name is Tim Hampton, and you can reach me at tim@unusuallywellinformed.com. Thanks for listening. I hope you will subscribe and join me for the next show with another unusually well-informed leader in business and technology.
Thank you for listening to the Unusually Well-Informed podcast. The opinions expressed by the host and guests on the Unusually Well-Informed podcast are their own and do not reflect that of their employer or any other affiliation.